Hi there. Welcome. My name is Professor Maggie Shiffrar, and we'll be spending this semester thinking about the field of psychology. I'm really glad you're here. It's going to be an incredible semester to study psychology. So welcome to CSUN's Psych 150 course. So let's start with our first slide. I've got a quote here by Milton. It says, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven out of hell and a hell out of heaven." I love that quote because it helps us to understand that psychology is about how we understand the world outside. Two people can look at the same world, think about it differently, and perceive it differently. And that's what makes psychology such an interesting field of study. Psychology as a science is the study of things we can see and measure, observable behaviors. So which way I'm pointing, which way I'm looking, how quickly I'm running. But it's also a study of the mind and what goes on in the mind, mental processes. So it's a study of our thoughts and feelings. It's a study of our attitudes and values. I'm going to give you some examples here of cases where mental processes might not be obvious. So in the top here, you see two pictures, one of a woman looking down the barrel of a handgun, and the other with a man holding a baby bear, a cub, as the cub's mother is approaching from the back. These are two extremely stupid actions. So why? Why did folks think they were a good idea at the time? What is the thought that led to these actions? Down below is a simple graph from a study that Pew conducted, a survey back in 2018, where they asked people from outside the U.S. what their beliefs and opinions were about the U.S. Now the U.S. it's one country, but you can see that people outside the U.S. are split almost 50-50 to whether they have favorable feelings towards the U.S. or unfavorable feelings towards the U.S. That difference is psychology. Let's start here with giving you an opportunity to see one thing in two different ways. And we're going to start with this new illusion that I just love. You can see, here's a static picture from the video that we're going to watch together. And it's a static picture of a bunny that's enjoying having its nose rubbed. Or that's what it looks like. Let's see what it actually is. We're going to look at a video of what initially might appear to you to be a bunny facing to the left, having its nose rubbed. All right? You can see the ears, the bunny just blinked. But I want you to look at it another way. Try to get your mind to see the bunny's ears as a beak of a raven or a crow facing to the right. Can you see it? Okay, originally I told you this was a bunny facing to the left, but look at it carefully and you'll see that it's actually a crow. It's a bird facing to the right. What you saw as the bunny's ears are actually the raven's beak. Can you see those bunny ears as a beak? So the person is actually rubbing the back of a raven's head, not the front of a bunny's nose. I hope you found that was kind of cool. If you couldn't see it both as a bunny and as a raven, then go back and check it out because it's a really interesting feeling to be able to interpret the same thing in two different ways. Another thing that research psychologists can study, as well as clinical psychologists, is why we do things that make us miserable. So a common example right now is social media. Many of us spend hours every day on our social media. But researchers have shown that the more hours you spend on social media, the more depressed you feel and the more isolated you feel. I know that's an odd thing to hear in the time of COVID when you don't have any other alternatives, but the people we become on social media, they're not really us. They live lives that are so much more interesting than we do. And that disconnect makes us feel awful. And yet, we still spend our time on social media. Another example is driving while texting. If you go down a freeway in Los Angeles, it's very easy to see the people who are paying attention to their cell phones and not paying attention to the roadway in front of them. It's very easy to see other people do that. It's very hard to see how terribly we drive when we're paying attention to our cell phones instead of paying attention to the act of driving. It's so bad, we'll cover this more later in the semester, but it's so bad that people who text while they drive are more dangerous than drunk drivers. They have more accidents than drunk drivers. Nobody drives drunk. You'd have to be crazy to drive drunk. But many people get behind the road and text while they're driving, in putting their very lives at risk. Why do we do these things? Psychology is a huge field, and as a result, there's many different types or subtypes of psychology. And to really understand an issue, what psychologists try to do is approach that issue from different directions, from the different subfields of psychology. So, for example, there is biological psychology or neuroscience, and that looks at the role of genes, brain activity, hormones, the role that those factors play in our behaviors and our mental processes. How does our brain give rise to thought, for example? There's also cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology studies learning and memory and language and perception, and we can look at how those processes influence what we do and how we feel. There's also external environmental factors that shape how we act and believe. So right now, many people in the world are hunkered down at home because of a pandemic, and that pandemic is changing what we do and how we think. There's also sociocultural factors. We all are part of one or more cultures, and those cultures tell us how we should behave and how we should think. And that plays a role in our actions and behaviors. So for example, let's say that you're a researcher or a clinician and you want to understand depression. You can understand depression from different ways, from different perspectives. You can take a biological approach and look at the role that genes or neurotransmitters or hormones or stress plays in depression. You could be a cognitive psychologist and study depression. A cognitive psychologist might look at the question of how depression leads people to perceive the world in a more negative light. You could look at behavioral approaches to depression. So one of the things that people who are depressed do is they interpret their actions as failures and they give up, which leads to greater depression. Sociocultural factors in depression. In some cultures, it's not okay to talk about how you're feeling. And what impact does that have on the study of depression? Okay, this is the end of our first mini lecture 1.1. I'll be right back with lecture 1.2, so hang on.